Feel the heavy titanium pulse of a story that beats with the rhythm of raw ambition and unbreakable resolve. We bring you the most intense cinematic experiences where the human heart meets the cold precision of destiny. Subscribe today and keep your finger on the pulse of greatness with us.
My son called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me he had made partner at 34 years old. I was standing in my kitchen in my old flannel shirt, drinking coffee from the same cracked mug I had used for 11 years, and I cried. Not because I was surprised. I had always known Daniel would get there. I cried because his mother would have loved to hear those words, and she had been gone for 6 years, and some good news just hits you differently when you have no one to call right after. He told me the firm was throwing a dinner to celebrate. His wife's family would be there. He said it casually, the way you say something when you are hoping the other person will just nod and move along. I nodded and moved along. I had met Claire's parents twice before. Once at the engagement party, once at the wedding. Both times, I showed up the same way. I always show up clean clothes, a firm handshake, nothing fancy. Her father, Victor Hargrove, had looked at my truck the first time I pulled into their driveway the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered onto his lawn. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Victor Hargrove had made his money in commercial real estate in the 90s and had never once let anyone in a 5-mile radius forget it. He wore his wealth the way some men wear cologne, too much of it. Applied everywhere. Impossible to ignore. His wife Margaret matched him in every way. Together they moved through rooms like they were doing the room a favor by being in it. Claire was not like them. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Claire loved my son, and she was good to him. And on the nights I sat with that cracked mug and thought about her parents, I reminded myself of that. She was not her father. She was just unlucky enough to have been raised by him. The dinner was at a place called Ashford Prime. It was the kind of restaurant where the menu has no prices and the lighting is dim enough that you feel like you are supposed to whisper. Daniel had texted me the address and added, without my asking, "Dress nice, Dad." I did not take offense. I understood what he was really saying. I wore a navy blazer I had owned for 15 years and pressed slacks and a tie that had belonged to my father. I drove my truck because it is what I drive. I parked 2 blocks away, which I will admit was a decision I made on purpose, though I did not examine too closely why. When I walked into Ashford Prime, the hostess brought me to a private dining room in the back. The Hargroves were already there. Victor stood at the head of the table, like he had been assigned the position by some governing body. Margaret sat to his right, draped in something that probably cost more than my truck. Claire was beside my son, and when Daniel saw me walk in, he stood up and crossed the room and hugged me. And that was the best part of the evening, right there in the first 30 seconds. Victor looked me over the way he always did. Slow, top to bottom, a full assessment. He shook my hand, without warmth. "Good of you to make it," he said, as though I had traveled a great distance to attend my own son's celebration. We sat down. There were 12 people at the table, colleagues of Daniel's from the firm, their spouses, the Hargroves, and me. I was seated at the far end, away from my son, across from a junior associate named Brendan, who spent most of the evening checking his phone. The evening started well enough. Daniel was gracious and funny, and the people from the firm clearly respected him. I watched him and felt the quiet, specific pride that is only available to parents, the kind that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. Then Victor stood to give a toast. He was good at this. I will give him that. He had the practiced ease of a man who had given 1,000 speeches and believed deeply that all of them had been excellent. He talked about Daniel's potential, about the firm, about the Hargrove family's long tradition of success. He talked for 4 minutes before he mentioned Claire's name. He did not mention mine at all. When he sat down, Daniel looked at me across the table and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Later, when the entrees arrived, Victor leaned across the table toward the associate named Brendan and said, in a voice that was not quite loud enough to address the whole table but was exactly loud enough to be heard by everyone at it, "Daniel's father drove up in quite a vehicle." I saw it in the lot when we arrived. He paused. Very authentic. There was a brief silence. The kind that happens when something unkind has been said, and everyone present is deciding how to respond to it. Brendan laughed. A short, uncertain sound. I cut my steak. I've had that truck for 22 years, I said pleasantly. Runs perfectly. Victor smiled the smile of a man who has landed a punch and is waiting to see if you noticed. Of course. Nothing wrong with practical. He let the word practical sit there between us like something he had placed deliberately on the table. Claire's hand moved toward my son's arm. Daniel was very still. I thought about saying more. I considered it for a full second and then let it go. I had learned over 63 years of living that the moments when you say nothing are often the ones you are most grateful for later. The dinner continued. After the entrees were cleared, Victor stood again. This time he asked the table to raise a glass to Daniel's future, and then he said, I want to acknowledge that Claire and I have made a significant investment in Daniel's trajectory. The connections we have provided, the opportunities, the introductions. He smiled warmly at my son. We are proud to have been part of building this. I held my wine glass and listened. Daniel was looking at the table. Then Victor turned his eyes to me, and his smile changed just slightly. And he said, and I'm sure his father is proud as well. In his own way. In his own way. The table was quiet. I looked at Victor Hargrove and I thought about a great many things in the space of about 4 seconds. I thought about the 11,000 nights I had spent working so my son could go to college without debt. I thought about the calls I had taken at 2 in the morning during Daniel's first year of law school when he was certain he had made a mistake and I had talked him back from the edge every single time. I thought about the summer he was 12 and I taught him to change the oil in that truck because I believed that a man should understand the things he depends on. I thought about the fact that Victor Hargrove had said in his own way to a room full of people my son worked with, and that Daniel had heard it, and that Daniel was still looking at the table. I smiled. I'm very proud, I said. He's worked hard his whole life. That was always his to do. It was not the most dramatic thing I could have said. It was not a speech, but something in the way I said it made the table feel different after, and I noticed that Victor did not speak again for several minutes. The dessert came. A woman from the firm named Patricia, who had been watching the evening with a quiet attention I respected, leaned toward me and asked how long I had lived in the area. We talked for 20 minutes about her garden and the drought the previous summer, and a hiking trail I had walked every September for the past decade. It was the most enjoyable conversation of the evening. When dinner ended and people were gathering coats, Victor found his way to my side. He had the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the evening had gone well for him. Your son is impressive, he said. He is, I agreed. Claire tells me you're retired. He said the word the way you might say stationary, more or less. He nodded slowly. What was it you did? Before. Property, I said. He brightened slightly. Oh, what kind? Commercial, mostly, I said. Some mixed-use development. He looked at me with slightly more interest than he had managed all evening. Here in the state? Here and a few other places. He was about to ask something else when Daniel appeared at my shoulder and said we should head out, and I put on my coat and said goodnight to Claire, who hugged me tightly and whispered I'm sorry into my shoulder, and I patted her back and told her not to be. I drove home in my truck. It ran perfectly, as it always does. 3 weeks later, Daniel called me. It was a Saturday morning, and I was walking the trail. I walked every September, except it was November now, and the leaves were all down. Dad, he said, I need to tell you something. I stopped walking. The firm's main office is in the Callaway building. On Meridian. I know where it is, I said. Victor found out this week. There was a long pause. He apparently looked it up after the dinner. The ownership records. He called Claire last night. I waited. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? I started walking again. The trail was empty. A crow called somewhere in the trees ahead. Tell you what, I said, that you own it. The Callaway building. You own the whole building, Dad. The firm has been leasing from you for 3 years. I had purchased the Callaway building in 2019 through a property management company I had been running quietly for 27 years. It was not the most valuable thing I owned. It was not even in the top 5, but it was a solid building in a good location, and the tenants paid on time. And when Daniel had told me which firm he was joining, I had checked the lease records and found my own name there and felt something I could not quite name, a small, private satisfaction, the kind that requires no audience. "It's just property," I said. "It's a 9-story building on Meridian Avenue, Dad. The important floors are 6 through 9. The lower ones are mostly storage and administrative." He was quiet for a moment. "Victor called Claire and told her that he Googled you. He found the property management company. He found the portfolio." Another pause. "He said he wanted to apologize for the dinner." I listened to the wind in the bare trees. "He wants to have us all over," Daniel continued. He said he didn't realize. That's what he said. He didn't realize. I thought about that phrase. Didn't realize. As if the problem at dinner had been a knowledge gap. As if the thing he needed in order to be kind was a property portfolio. "Daniel," I said, "you know you don't need to do anything about this." "I know. If Victor Hargrove wants to have a dinner, you can go or not go based on whether you want to go. Not based on what he found on the internet." My son was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I counted 11 steps on the trail before he spoke again. "I should have said something at dinner," he said. "When he said that thing, in his own way, I should have said something. You were in a room with your colleagues. That's not an excuse." "No," I said. "It isn't," he exhaled. "I didn't know about the building. But I should have said something regardless." "You know now," I said. "I do." We talked for another 20 minutes about other things, a leak in his guest bathroom, a case he was working on that interested him, whether I was coming for Thanksgiving. When we hung up, I stood at a bend in the trail where a creek crossed under a small wooden bridge, and I listened to the water for a while. "I want to tell you something about money, because I think people misunderstand it. I grew up with very little. My father worked in a machine shop and my mother cleaned houses 3 days a week, and we had enough, just barely. And I knew from the age of about 8 that enough just barely was a condition you could change if you were willing to be patient and disciplined and honest, and occasionally lucky. So I was patient and disciplined and honest, and I had some luck along the way. And over 40 years of careful decisions, I had built something real. Not to impress anyone, not to put on the side of a building. Because I had grown up with enough just barely, and I never wanted my son to feel that particular specific anxiety that comes from not knowing if you are safe. I never talked about it because I had watched what happened to men who talked about it. They became the talking. Everything else about them disappeared. I drove an old truck because I liked it. I wore a 15-year-old blazer because it fit well and it had been my father's tie, and there was no occasion important enough to require me to pretend I was someone other than who I was. Victor Hargrove had looked at my truck and my blazer and the way I held my fork and assembled a conclusion. He had done it quickly and confidently and publicly, which told me everything about how he had always moved through the world. When you have spent your life performing your own worth for every room you enter, you assume everyone else is doing the same, and you judge by the performance. I was not performing anything. I never had been. What happened over the following month was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that. I am not the kind of man who plans humiliation for other people. I find it exhausting and it accomplishes very little, but things happen in sequence. And sometimes, the sequence is its own kind of justice. Victor Hargrove, it turned out, had been in early conversations with a development group that wanted to purchase the Callaway building and 3 adjacent properties to build a mixed-use tower. He had positioned himself as a broker in those conversations, quietly, without disclosing that he had a personal connection to a tenant. When the development group reached out to my property management company, they eventually reached me. I listened to the offer. It was reasonable. I considered it for about 2 weeks. Then I called my attorney and told him I was not selling. Not to that group. I also called Patricia, the woman from the firm dinner, the one who had asked about my garden. It turned out she was a senior partner and had known for some months that the firm's lease was up for renewal. I offered a 10-year renewal at the existing rate with a tenant improvement allowance for the 6th floor, which was where Daniel's new office was going to be. She accepted. Victor's development deal collapsed when the anchor property was removed from the offering. I did not do this to hurt him. I did it because I had decided I was not ready to sell, and because a 10-year lease with a firm where my son was a partner made simple sense. But the effect was the same. Daniel told me about it on the phone in February, careful and neutral, giving me the facts without interpretation. Victor had called Claire. He was upset. He felt he used the word outmaneuvered, Daniel said. I thought about that for a moment. I didn't maneuver anything. I know. I made a business decision. I know that too. How is Claire? She's fine. She's been fine, actually. She told him that what he said at dinner was unkind. There was a brief pause. She said she should have said it sooner. I felt something settle in my chest. The particular quiet of something resolved. She's good, I said. She is, my son agreed. And I could hear the love in his voice. The same way you can hear water in a wall before you ever see it. Just a faint and steady evidence of something real and moving. I want to tell you something about my father. He worked in a machine shop for 31 years. He came home every evening with grease under his nails, and he washed his hands at the kitchen sink before he sat down. And he always sat down in the same chair, and he asked me and my brother about our days with what I understood, only much later, was genuine interest, not performance, not ritual. He actually wanted to know. He never made much money. He drove an old car. He wore simple clothes. He was the most dignified man I have ever known. When people looked at him the way Victor Hargrove looked at me, that slow assessment, that quiet conclusion, my father would simply continue being exactly who he was. He did not adjust to their expectations. He did not perform for them. He held his position the way a good building holds its ground quietly, without announcement, without any particular need to be noticed. I think about him when I am on that trail in November, when the leaves are all gone, and you can see further into the trees than any other time of year. It is always quieter then, more legible. You see the shape of things you couldn't see before. I went to Daniel and Claire's for Thanksgiving. Claire made a turkey, and I brought a pie. The same pie I have brought every year since my wife used to make it. The recipe written on a card in her handwriting that I keep folded in the back of a kitchen drawer. Claire has tried to learn it 2 years in a row, and she is getting closer. Victor and Margaret came. This was not my preference, but it was not my house, and it was not my holiday to dictate. When Victor arrived, he shook my hand with more pressure than usual, the handshake of a man trying to communicate something without having to find the words for it. We did not discuss the building. We did not discuss the development deal. We sat at a long table and ate turkey, and the conversation moved around us the way conversation does in houses that have love in them sometimes, including you, sometimes passing over you, always warm. At one point during dessert, Victor said quietly to no one in particular, I looked into your management company. I did not respond. You've been doing this a long time, he said. I have. He nodded. He was not comfortable. He was trying, which I respected if not warmly. I said something at that dinner that wasn't right, he said. He said it to his pie. It wasn't. I agreed. He looked up then. He had expected, I think, more resistance or more grace, or perhaps just a longer performance on my end, the formal acceptance of an apology, the reassurance that no harm was done. I did not give him any of that, because harm had been done, and it would not be useful to pretend otherwise. I looked at him steadily, the way my father had always looked at people who underestimated him, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the calm and uncomplicated certainty of a man who had always known exactly who he was. I appreciate you saying it, I said. And then I asked Margaret if she wanted more coffee, and she did. And I got up and got the pot. And the evening continued. On the drive home, in the truck that runs perfectly, and has run perfectly for 22 years, I thought about what it means to earn someone's respect. I have watched men spend their whole lives working for it, performing, accumulating, announcing, building things not because the building matters but because they need the building to be seen. I understand the impulse. I do not judge it. But I made a different choice. A long time ago, when I watched my father wash grease from his hands at the kitchen sink and then sit in his chair and ask about my day with complete and genuine attention, I decided the only respect worth having was the kind that does not require you to change what you are to receive it. Daniel called me the following Sunday, just to talk. He did that sometimes, called without an occasion, and those calls were my favorite ones, the unscheduled ones, because they meant he was thinking of me when nothing was happening, which is the truest form of being thought of. He asked about the trail. He asked about the pie. He asked if I had thought about updating the truck, and I laughed and said I had not, and he laughed too. At the end of the call, he said, "Dad, I want you to know something." I waited. I've known for a while. The building. Not the whole portfolio, but the Callaway building. I figured it out about 6 months after I joined the firm. I saw the property records by accident, doing research on a lease dispute for a client. I was quiet. I didn't say anything because I didn't think you wanted me to, he said. And because it didn't change anything. You were still my father. I was still going to do my job. None of it changed anything. I stood in my kitchen with my cracked mug, and I looked out the window at the yard my wife had planted and tended and left behind. The yard I had kept exactly as she made it, because some things you maintain not for yourself but because they were someone else's best work. You're right, I said. It doesn't change anything. I know, he said. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, which is to say we talked about everything that mattered. After I hung up, I washed out my mug and set it on the counter. I put on my coat and my boots and I drove, not to the trail but just through the town, the long way around. Past the machine shop where my father had worked for 31 years, past the school where Daniel had learned to read, past the block where the Callaway building stood with its 9 quiet stories, doing exactly what a good building should do, holding its ground, supporting the people inside it, asking for nothing in return. I drove home. I parked the truck in the driveway. I went inside and put on the kettle and found my wife's recipe card in the back of the kitchen drawer, and held it for a moment in the particular way you hold something that belongs to someone who is gone, carefully, with both hands, for slightly longer than is necessary. Then I put it back. There is a thing I want to tell you. If you have stayed with me this long, the men who looked at me the way Victor Hargrove looked at me, I have met them my whole life. They look at your truck and your clothes and they run their calculation and they file you somewhere in their mind and they move on. That is their right. I do not begrudge them it. But here is what I have learned over 63 years of being looked at that way. The calculation they are running has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with them. The standard they have accepted as real. The ledger they have built their sense of self upon. When they look at your truck and find you wanting, they are not measuring you. They are revealing themselves. My father knew this. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and he sat in his chair, and he asked about my day. He never once adjusted himself to meet someone else's measure. I am trying, still, to be that kind of man. I think some days I get close.